right. Good morning. This is an overview of the evolution of globalization per the ideas of Thomas Friedman of the New York Times in his work, The World is Flat. And I've read it a couple different times. Pretty interesting work. Right now, what we're going to do is just go through a very basic overview of globalization. What is globalization? How it all came about? And hopefully get us to a spot that for the next video, we can look at the 10 flatteners that Friedman talked about since 1989. So without further ado, let's look at the globalization evolution. So how do we describe globalization? As you can see, there's a ton of words that can be used, but I think the biggest ones are technology, trade, and communications. And think about today. Think about something you have that is purely domestic made. Very rare. A lot of cases we're looking at the idea that everything we have is made somewhere else or made with parts from somewhere else. If you look at your cell phones, they've changed quite a bit. If you look at a jump drive, which pretty much is a dinosaur, but for a lot of people still works for long-term storage. Those were made in other countries. In fact, I'm looking at one right now, and it's printed so small, it's probably made in China or Vietnam. I mean, you look at the car parts. Look at the role of not just for manufacturing, but for markets now, and how it's changed. And really, globalization has been going on since the beginning of history. As long as they've traded, societies have traded, and they've moved beyond what they consider their realm of the world, which the world itself, according to Friedman, is flat. And that's not really a totally true statement. It's just flat in the economic realms and how we communicate. It's gotten smaller. In other words, we can reach farther without having to leave where we are. And the internet has been a big part of that. Technology has been a driving force in everything. Think about how things work. We had the wheel, chariots, horse-drawn carriages. With weaponry, it's changed. With communications, it's changed from simple snail mail to Morse code, to radio, to television, to digital television, to the internet, to virtual communications and things like this that you're watching today. So what is globalization? It is actually the integration of economies throughout the world, according to Friedman. And he characterizes it as having three distinct phases brought about by technology and innovation in technology. You think about the person who's developed the steam engine and how that could be used for industrialization and then put into use with riverboats. Or the gasoline engine, how it made cars, airplanes, jet fuel, jet engines with the Germans and the technology that we use to get us to space. Think about how technology has changed. And I'm going to use two incidents. How we found out about man on the moon. 1969, it was analog. Satellites, it was slow. There was a delay. In this last decade, we've had the Arab Spring, where we knew right away, thanks to social networking, and it organized these movements. So movements are organized, communication is better, and the world could really be flat, but yet might not be. Let's look at Friedman's arguments. See if we can dissect them. Now, this is a image of a video, a YouTube video. If you type in Friedman 3 phases of globalization, you could watch it. It's about a 3-minute video, and it explains the 3 phases that he talks about. And he's going to have 3 different phases: globalization 1.0, 2.0, 3.0. And I think we're into a new phase of 3.0. We might be 3.0 version 2 or 3. So what he talks about here is globalization, in his mind, began in 1492, when the world went from one size, it was large, to a size medium. By medium, it's the contact between people. Before 1492, we knew there were other civilizations out there. There were other lands. There were places to get to. How do we get there? Well, we use technology, the caravel, designed by Portuguese sailors and the Spanish sailors, using the astrolabe. We use technologies to get us there. And then in the 1800s, early 1900s, we went to globalization 2.0, and then globalization 3.0, which is where we're at today. Colonialism is a big part of this, and one of the driving factors was the desire by European nations for resources and wealth. And the concept of mercantilism comes in. This, I know it says European colonization. That's what they're talking about with European colonization to 1945. In other words, the post-World War II era, when colonies became independent nations between 1945 and about 1965 to 70. And this is our first wave. Globalization 1.0. Obviously, the late 15th century to about 1800. Now you think about this. Look at Spain, look at England, look at France. They built empires in the New World. First it was Spain, the 1500s were the Spanish century. And then after that, after the Armada, England and France really took over in North America. Central America was still Spanish domains. Portugal as well, and parts of South America. The Dutch became a factor in Europe and in trading. And the main impact of this was through mercantilism, is that a nation's wealth was determined not by what it had for cash, but what it had for colonies. And those colonies could be serving as raw materials for goods and markets for finished products. And part of that was an impetus behind the American Revolution. The fact that Americans wanted free trade. They wanted to trade with the French. They wanted to trade with the Dutch. They wanted to trade with the Spanish. And England wanted to control trade. It also meant trying to get ways in the New World to extend their power. And power, not just political, but also gaining things they could use, like domesticated horses for transportation and agriculture, wind, using technologies that were discovered in the New World, and later on, steam, which was primarily used for mining initially. Collectively, we brought the continents together and shrunk the size. Globalization 2.0 took on a different, they phase in, depends on where you're at in North America. Our globalization 2.0 came much later. In Europe, it was a little bit earlier. And we went from a size medium to a size small, with companies, no longer countries, but companies driving globalization between the Americans and the Europeans. The 1800s up till about, I'd say the late 1880s, Europe really drove globalization, looking for markets. I mean, you look at the amount of colonies that were taken in by European nations. And why were they done? And then eventually you get Germany coming into this, and German companies, they need raw materials like iron ore and rubber and gas. And part of this is due to the technologies. We went from wood ships to steel ships brought on by better iron. We went railroads. You had the steam engine, which was initially used for mining. Robert Fulton figured out a way to put it on a boat, and you could sail upriver, which meant trade was more efficient. You had canals which could connect lakes, especially in North America. We tried it on our own, and then we were able to use it later on in an era of expansion, especially in the Pacific. Look at why we gained Hawaii as a territory. The desire to get away from having to pay taxes by companies like Dole Fruit. They didn't want to pay their taxes. They thought, let's overthrow the legitimate government, make it a U.S. colony, a territory. And then you get guys like the Wright brothers. And the airplane emerged through different technologies, and the same thing with space travel through about 2000. We went from analog, flying to the moon with basically a slide rule, a computer that was huge, where a cell phone today, your average smartphone is going to have a more powerful computer than they used to fly to the moon. And it changed. Globalization, we started importing vehicles, Japanese vehicles, German vehicles, the Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMWs, Volvos. Everything took form in what we got from around the world and how we could trade around the world as well. So now we've got the 3.0, and it's shrinking the world from small to tiny. And by what they mean is the driving force here is not big technology, but it is a small strand, fiber optics. And it's individuals utilizing the technologies that exist. So we went from small to tiny. And instead of companies and nations, it's individuals and small groups that are the drivers of this globalizing movement. Think about what we had. If you know somebody who was around, maybe your parents, maybe yourself, in the 1970s, our television was pretty simple. Antenna, 4 or 5 channels tops. Then you just got cable, and we went to satellite. When the first PCs came out in the early 1980s, they were driven by 5 1/4 inch floppy disks, which held 512 kilobyte of information. I remember when I first started teaching on the community college level, we used a 256 megabyte jump drive. Now, I use nothing smaller than a 32 gig, or I use cloud storage. And this is where we got this age of information. People are coming up with all sorts of information and how to get it out to people. Think of all the websites that have been created and how many domain names that are out there that you can't get to. And we're looking at this one thing. Google, developed in 1998, is the world's largest search engine. It used to be Yahoo, Bing, you used to have Netscape. Technology has changed, and it's in a more rapid proliferation of information with more people, where before it was controlled by smaller groups. You think about the individuals as the drivers too. You think of the Arab Spring. That was driven in Egypt by a Google executive. The movements in Tunisia, same thing, driven by the internet. It has made the world more compact, easier to talk to, but also just as dangerous as it was before. One of the key factors to this movement is technology and societal change. We are in an information age where we want instant gratification. Instead of centuries, it changes in decades now. And we're going to talk later on about Friedman's 10 flatteners. He gave us 10 flatteners, and I'm going to summarize them pretty simple right here without getting into too much detail, with one statement. When the walls fell down, the windows went up. And with that, we'll prepare for the next presentation on the 10 flatteners, according to Tom Friedman. Now you look at a rehash of this. Globalization. Who reinvents himself now? Countries reinvented themselves in globalization 1.0. Businesses had to reinvent themselves. They couldn't rely on domestic markets. They had to sell abroad. And they also had to come up with resources from abroad. And today, it's individuals who have to reinvent themselves. Look at Mark Zuckerberg, how diversified he's gotten with Facebook, or any of the search engines, or any of the web pages that you use on a daily basis, any of the news pages. Look at how they have to reinvent themselves to keep up with technology. And with that being said, we will get away from this. And in this, hopefully you'll get something out of it. And we'll begin on another video with Friedman's 10 flatteners.